Chapter 24. Jacob kidnapped, crimped, stolen away. To say that I was shocked is too mild. I might as well use other words such as dumbstruck, appalled, and finally helpless. Never had I been so frightened. Except the bigger truth was, I did not know what to do. Numb. Some part of me did not even want to believe what Sam had suggested. It was too horrific. Or maybe he was just trying to get me to go away, scare me off. Next moment I realized how much he had helped me. After all, he had been told not to speak to me by his father and by Mr. Castle. But although Sam didn't owe me or Jacob anything, he had told me a great deal, at real risk. I was touched, grateful. There was something else. If I didn't want to believe it, the only way to prove Sam wrong was to find Jacob. Or have Jacob show up on his own. Otherwise, I had to believe Sam, didn't I? But what if what Sam said was true? I must find Jacob fast, or he'd disappear forever. Wobbly, struggling for breath, trying desperately to think what I could do. I cannot say which hurt more, my head, stomach, or heart. Somehow I made my way back into town. Once there, I went to Montgomery Street and stood on the edge of the cove. From that vantage point I gazed out at the forsaken ships, which is to say, Rotten Row. The truth is, I had not spent much time thinking about the ships. Yes, they were there when our ship landed, and I had been curious about them, noticing that their numbers had much increased since we arrived. There were many hundreds now. But as far as I had been concerned, they were simply part of the madness that was San Francisco. Yes, odd, truly strange, but not for a moment did I consider that they might have anything to do with me or Jacob. But as I stood on the beach that moment and observed the empty ships, I saw the bulky, rotting hulks with altogether different eyes. It may seem fantastical, but crowded together as they were, some wedged so tightly I could have walked from one to another, they seemed alive, distressingly alive. Since the cove waters rippled some, the unoccupied ships shifted slightly, chafing and bumping one against another, making squeaking, grinding, and rasping sounds that reached the beach. It was almost as if the entire desolate fleet were some kind of wounded beast, masts, spars, and yards poking out in a million different ways, a bristled fiend's saith or a gigantic multi-horned and spiked but dying monster. The idea that Jacob had been hidden away on one of those many ships, swallowed Jonah-like, was beyond horrifying. Because if it was true, how might I ever be able to find him? Never in my life had I been so unnerved. I was absolutely sick. With my insides feeling like they were stuffed with stones, I stood there, more dead than alive. The more I stood there trying to make up my mind and control my feelings, the more I felt it was my fault that Jacob was gone. Knowing he had been unhappy, I should never, as Señor Rosales had gently hinted, have left him behind when I had gone down the bay with Thad. Let it be admitted, just the day before, I had pictured myself a grand, independent adult. It had been wonderful to think I was free and liberated. Now I rued the moment. In truth, I had grossly neglected my responsibilities. I had been arrogant. Do you wish to feel young? Be humiliated. And what if mother or father returned, and I could not tell them where Jacob was? The thought made me nauseous. I must find Jacob, yet how? I had no idea. Beyond all else, I felt terribly alone. Next moment I was overcome by an urgent need to speak to someone, as if to get away from my own frights. Yet understand, in San Francisco, other than in Happy Valley, there was no such thing as a neighborhood. It was not like Providence, where I knew everyone who lived on Sheldon Street as they knew me. Yes, the tents near us were occupied, but the young men who lived in them came and went like so many wispy clouds in the sky. As for women, there were so few, and if they were not at saloons, they ran boarding-houses or helped with the husband's business. I knew none. There was Señor Rosales, but he was overworked with his café. Who was I to turn to? As you might have guessed, it was Thad. I ran to the store where he worked, and found him quick enough. He was clerking behind one of the counters, offering shovels and picks to a boisterous line of new arrivals. As soon as he saw me, he called out, "Find him?" Too agitated to talk, I merely shook my head. He must have seen how troubled I was, because he said, "What happened?" I wasn't going to repeat aloud what Sam had told me. I only said, "Come to my tent, soon as you can." "Will do." I turned and fairly fled from the store, pushing my way through crowds of miners, who jeered and rebuked me for my belligerence. I did not care. I ran back uphill to our tent as fast as possible, forcing my way through the usual mobs. As I went, I kept repeating the same prayer in my head. Be there, oh dear God, please let Jacob be there. I reached the tent and fairly well leaped inside. Jacob was not there. Whatever strength remained in me shrank to nothing, dissolved. I flung myself onto Jacob's bed and burst into tears. I beg you to understand, crying was something I loathed. But at that moment I could not help myself. I sobbed. My whole body trembled. My chest hurt. I could barely breathe. "What am I going to do?" I wailed aloud. "What am I going to do?" I found Mother's shawl and wrapped it around me. How I missed her. From across the way I heard Señor Rosales call out, "Corderita, did you find him?" He must have seen me rush into the tent. Perhaps he'd heard my cries. I sat up, worked to suppress my gulps of grief, and pawed at my wet face. "Corderita," he called again. "What is it? What's the matter?" Next moment Señor Rosales did something he had never done before. He stuck his head into our tent. "¿Qué pasó? What did you learn about Jacob? What has happened?" I looked up at him. My unhappy face must have revealed my ghastly feelings and frightened thoughts, because he came all the way in. More, he squatted down before me and put out a kind hand, which I clutched eagerly with both of mine, even as I wetted it with tears. His gaze was full of sympathy. "Corderita, por favor, you must tell me. What's happened?" Haltingly, now and again snuffling, struggling to keep from crumbling anew into sobs and tears, I told Señor Rosales all that Sam had told me, and what I feared had happened to Jacob. His face showed alarm and anger. "Santo Dios," he murmured, and made the sign of the cross over his chest more than once. "I have heard rumors of such terrible things," he said, "but Jacob, un niño, I warned your father of this place. Lobos, see, there are wolves here. Do you truly think that's what happened to him?" Tears flowed down my cheeks. "I don't know," I wailed. "I just have to find him." It was hard for me to talk or breathe. "Very well. On the square, the police chief, Señor Malachi Fallon, has his office in the old schoolhouse. There are police officers as well. Someone will help." "Do you think so?" "Corderita, Señor Fallon is la policia. He must find Jacob. It's his obligation. Come, I'll go with you." "Will you?" I said, deeply grateful for his help. "Corderita, I've told you many times. I think of you as my daughter, Jacob my son. My daughter isn't here because, as I told your esteemed padre, this city is not safe for young people. Forgive me. His leaving you was a mistake. This proves me right. But since you are my local daughter, well then I will help." I jumped up and hugged him. He hugged me back. "Vamos," he said. "Now we must find Señor Fallon. As that boy Sam told you, if all of this is true, we must act rapidamente." "Señor," I said, "one thing. You cannot say anything about Sam." "Why?" "He's worried that he will be blamed." "Fine, whatever you say. Now we must hurry.